You thought you could walk around here?
Never.
You will never marry in life. Get away from me. How dare you touch me?
No. Stay down. You hear me? Stay down in the filth. Don't you ever show your face here again.
He sprayed mud water on his ex-wife, unaware she was no longer the woman he left behind. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ocean of Tales. Kindly watch, comment, and subscribe on this channel if you are new in this place. We will be grateful if you help us do this. We will be notifying you when we drop a new video. Don't forget to tell us where you are watching from. He laughed as he lifted the bucket and sprayed muddy water all over the woman standing before him. Not just any woman. His ex-wife. The same woman he once walked away from. The one he swore would never amount to anything without him. She didn't scream. She didn't fight back. She just stood there, soaked, silent, humiliated. What he didn't know was that this wasn't the woman he left behind. He thought she was still broken, still struggling, still begging life for mercy. He didn't know the car parked across the street belonged to her. He didn't know the documents in her bag carried power. And he didn't know that the people watching this moment were about to decide his future. Because in a few minutes, the man who sprayed mud in pride would realize he had just humiliated the wrong woman. And when the truth comes out, this time, there will be no forgiveness. Sunlight slammed down on the Lagos street like a spotlight, turning the puddles into mirrors and the dust into smoke, as Daniel Moore stepped out of his black SUV with a plastic bucket swinging from his hand. The bucket was heavy, sloshing, and the smell hit first. Mud water mixed with gutter rot and the sharp sting of detergent someone poured into a drainage line. He didn't hide it. He wanted the whole compound to see what he carried, the way a man carries a trophy. He adjusted his designer cuffs like he was about to sign a deal, not ruin a person. Across from him, Amara Stone stood near the gate in a simple dress that clung to her skin from the heat, her shoes already dusty, her hair pulled back like she had come to finish something quietly and leave. Daniel's lips curled in a smile that wasn't joy, but permission. Permission to disrespect. His friends by the kiosk leaned forward, hungry. The security man pretended to check his phone. A woman selling sachet water paused mid-step. And when Daniel lifted the bucket higher, letting the brown liquid roll toward the edge, Amara didn't flinch. Not once, like she already knew what was coming, but why would anyone stand still for this? Heat trembled above the pavement as Daniel's laughter burst out loud, sharp, and contagious in the way cruelty can be when it has an audience. He took one exaggerated step closer, letting the bucket tilt just enough for a few drops to splash down, testing the moment like a man testing a microphone. A boy on a bicycle slowed down. Two ladies under an umbrella stopped gossiping and simply watched. The compound across the road had music playing low, but even that seemed to fade, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Daniel's voice cut through the noon haze, mocking, familiar, practiced, saying her name like it was a joke he owned. Amara's eyes stayed forward, calm and glassy, not begging, not angry, not scared, just focused. That stillness confused people more than tears ever could. Daniel mistook it for defeat. He mistook silence for weakness. He wanted her to plead so he could deny her. He wanted her to shake so he could call it evidence that she was still nothing without him. His hand tightened on the bucket handle, and the crowd leaned closer for the splash. But what if she wasn't standing there to be punished? Mud water exploded outward in a thick arc, smacking Amara's chest and face like a slap you could see. The force made her dress cling in ugly streaks, brown rivulets sliding down her arms, dripping from her elbows to the ground. A few drops caught her eyelashes, and for a second, she blinked slowly, as if clearing dust from her vision. The smell rose immediately, wet earth mixed with drainage, turning heads and making noses wrinkle. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else gasped and covered their mouth like they were watching a crime they couldn't stop. Daniel threw his head back, satisfied, the way a man smiles when he believes he has finished a lesson. He stepped sideways so others could see her full body, soaked and quiet, like he was presenting proof that he still had power over her. The street reacted in layers. Phones came out, murmurs buzzed, a neighbor's curtain moved, and the security man shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable but still silent. Amara didn't wipe her face. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She stood there with mud water sliding down her skin like a slow punishment, and the most frightening thing was that she looked like a woman waiting for her turn to speak. Dust swirled around Daniel's expensive shoes as he walked in a loose circle, enjoying the moment the way some men enjoy applause. He pointed at Amara's wet dress, at the mud staining her neckline, and his grin widened as if the humiliation was a story he would tell later with pride. His friends chuckled, shaking their heads, adding small comments that felt like pebbles thrown at a person already drowning. A passerby muttered, "This is too much," then kept moving because Lagos has taught people to survive by minding their own business. The woman with sachet water adjusted her tray and whispered something to another vendor, and the whisper spread like smoke. That's his ex-wife. That's the one he divorced. That's the one he said was useless. Daniel soaked it in, feeding on the chorus, because community shame is a drug to people who fear being small. He stepped close enough for Amara to smell his cologne over the gutter stench, close enough to remind her that he still believed he owned the ending of her story. Amara finally moved, not backward, not away, but one small step forward, steady and controlled, as if she was approaching a finish line, and Daniel's smile twitched, because why would a humiliated woman step closer? Wind scraped across the road, carrying grit and the distant honk of traffic, as Amara lowered her eyes. Not in surrender, but in calculation. Mud dripped from her chin onto the concrete in slow, deliberate drops, each one loud in the silence between the crowd's whispers. She reached into her bag with fingers that didn't tremble, the bag pressed against her hip like a shield. People expected a handkerchief, a tissue, a desperate wipe. Daniel expected her to clean herself so he could laugh again. Instead, her hand came out holding something firm and dry. An envelope, thick, sealed, untouched by the mess because it had been wrapped in plastic. The sight of it didn't make sense to the crowd yet, but it made Daniel narrow his eyes like he'd just seen a weapon he couldn't name. His laughter slowed. The boy on the bicycle stopped completely. Even the security man lifted his head, suddenly alert. Amara didn't open the envelope. She only held it, letting them see it, letting the sun hit the stamp and the embossed print like it mattered. Daniel scoffed, trying to recover the moment with another cruel joke, but his voice came out thinner, because what kind of ex-wife brings sealed documents to a public humiliation? A car door clicked softly from across the street, almost lost under the noise of Lagos, and yet it cut through the scene like a blade. Heads turned. A sleek vehicle sat there, too clean, too polished, parked too perfectly like it had been waiting. It wasn't the kind of car that belonged to a random observer or a curious passerby. It looked official without shouting, expensive without trying. The tinted window lowered just a little, revealing nothing clear, only the hint of someone watching from inside with patience. Daniel's eyes darted toward it, then back to Amara, then back again, irritation creeping into his posture. The crowd noticed the shift in him first. The way his shoulders tightened, the way he stopped performing and started scanning. Amara didn't look at the car yet. She kept her gaze on Daniel, steady, like she was making him stay present for what he'd done. Mud water continued dripping from her clothes, but now it felt less like humiliation and more like a costume she wore on purpose. Daniel took a half step back, then tried to mask it with another laugh, louder, forced. But why would a woman he called finished arrive with papers and an expensive car waiting like a witness? A distant siren rose and fell somewhere deeper in the city, not close enough to confirm anything, but close enough to plant fear like a seed. Daniel's friends started shifting, their smiles fading as the crowd's mood changed from entertainment to unease. The security man moved closer to the gate, suddenly remembering his job. Amara lifted the sealed envelope slightly, letting Daniel see the printed letterhead through the plastic, letting his eyes catch words that didn't belong in a street argument. Words like registration, ownership, transfer, petition, court. words that could rearrange a man's life without touching his body. Daniel's face tightened, as if he'd swallowed something sharp. He tried to speak over it, tried to dominate the air again, but the audience wasn't laughing like before. The gossip had changed flavor. It wasn't look at her anymore. It was, wait, what is that? Amara finally raised her hand to her face, not to wipe the mud away, but to push wet hair from her eyes so she could see clearly, like a soldier clearing vision before impact. And when she took one more calm step forward, the entire street felt the shift, because the real question wasn't why she stayed silent. It was what she came here to reveal. Memory hit Daniel more like a familiar song the moment he looked at Amara standing there, soaked and silent, because in his mind she had always existed in one fixed version. He remembered her as the woman who waited, the woman who adjusted her dreams to fit his moods, the woman who used to lower her voice when he raised his, who apologized first even when she didn't understand what she'd done wrong. That was the Amara he carried in his head. The one who stayed behind closed doors, counting money carefully, hoping tomorrow would be kinder. As he stared at her now, mud-streaked and steady, his brain tried to force her back into that smaller shape. People don't change that much, he told himself. Not women like her. Not without him. That belief gave him confidence. It always had. And yet, something about the way she stood, spine straight, shoulders relaxed, didn't match the memory he was clinging to. So, why did she look like someone who had already survived him? The past rewound further, to their early days, when Daniel had mistaken Amara's softness for weakness and her patience for dependence. Back then, he used to introduce her with half pride, half dismissal, describing her as simple and supportive, words that sounded kind but slowly stripped her of depth. He believed he was the engine and she was the passenger, lucky to be along for the ride. When money was tight, he blamed her bad luck. When things improved, he credited his own effort. Over time, he stopped asking her opinions, stopped sharing plans, stopped noticing when she went quiet in rooms full of people. In his version of the story, she had no identity outside being his wife, and once that title was gone, so was her importance. Standing there now, Daniel judged her through that old lens, convinced the woman before him was only a faded copy of the woman he left. But why did his chest feel tight like something didn't fit? Divorce, in Daniel's mind, wasn't a failure, it was an upgrade. He remembered walking out with certainty, telling himself he was choosing growth, ambition, a better life. Amara, to him, became a chapter he closed without rereading. He assumed she stayed exactly where he left her, struggling, resentful, dependent on pity from relatives who whispered his name with regret. He never checked. He never asked. He never looked back. In his story, she was a cautionary tale he could point to whenever he wanted to feel superior. That assumption powered his cruelty now, made the bucket feel light in his hand. He believed he was humiliating someone already defeated. But as he watched the mud drip from her clothes without panic or shame, doubt crept in like a quiet leak, because defeated people don't stand like that. Daniel's memory jumped to small moments he used to ignore. The nights Amara stayed awake after he slept, the way she read quietly while he scrolled his phone, the questions she stopped asking because they annoyed him. He used to think her silence meant agreement. He used to think her calm meant she needed him. Only now, watching her absorb humiliation without breaking, did another possibility flicker uncomfortably. What if that silence had always been strength he never bothered to understand? The idea unsettled him, and he shoved it away quickly, replacing it with the version of her that made him comfortable, the needy ex-wife, the woman who would crumble if pushed hard enough. He straightened his shoulders again, clinging to that belief like armor. But why did his laughter feel forced now? Across the street, the polished car remained still, a quiet contradiction to Daniel's memories. It didn't belong in the version of Amara he knew. It didn't belong in the story where she stayed behind, struggling quietly. Daniel's eyes flicked to it again, irritation growing, as if the car itself was insulting him by existing. He tried to connect it to someone else, an onlooker, a neighbor, a coincidence, but his mind kept circling back to Amara, to the envelope in her hand, to the calm weight of her presence. The crowd's whispers grew bolder now, reshaping the narrative in real time, and Daniel hated that he wasn't controlling it anymore. He wanted the past to stay fixed. He needed her to stay small. But what if the woman he thought he knew had outgrown the version of herself he left behind? Heat pressed harder on Daniel's skin as confusion bled into frustration. He replayed the reasons he left her, rehearsed them silently like a legal defense. She didn't push him enough. She didn't challenge him. She didn't fit the future he imagined. Those excuses had always worked before. They had allowed him to move on without guilt. Yet here she was, muddy and composed, holding something that looked dangerously official, and suddenly his justifications felt thin. The audience watching could sense it too, the subtle shift from confidence to uncertainty, from dominance to defense. Daniel tightened his jaw, trying to recover control with posture and presence, but posture doesn't stop truth when it starts walking toward you. Amara finally lifted her eyes fully to his, and the look she gave him wasn't anger or sadness. It was recognition. Not recognition of who he was now, but of who he had always been. Daniel felt exposed in a way he couldn't name, like a man realizing too late that the person he underestimated had been studying him quietly for years. The crowd leaned in again, sensing the shift, sensing that the past Daniel relied on was about to be challenged by something real and irreversible. And as Amara adjusted her grip on the envelope, the question hanging in the air wasn't about who she used to be anymore, it was about what Daniel was about to lose. Morning routines once filled their small apartment with soft sounds, kettles humming, slippers brushing tiles, sunlight crawling slowly across the floor, but over time those sounds thinned out, replaced by long silences that felt heavier than arguments. Daniel stopped noticing when Amara spoke less, when her questions became shorter, when her laughter disappeared in pieces. Love didn't collapse in one loud moment. It drained quietly, day after day, until what remained was habit and impatience. He started correcting her in public, rolling his eyes at her opinions, letting jokes land that made others laugh at her expense. Each moment seemed small on its own, almost harmless, but together they carved something permanent. Amara felt herself shrinking in rooms where she once felt safe, and Daniel mistook that shrinking for proof that she needed him. But when affection fades without noise, how do you even know when it's gone? Evenings grew colder without changing temperature, as Daniel's words shifted from careless to sharp, from dismissive to deliberate. He compared her to women who were louder, richer, more ambitious, letting those comparisons hang in the air like verdicts. He didn't shout. He didn't hit. He simply withdrew warmth, which somehow hurt more. Amara tried to adjust, to become easier, quieter, more convenient, believing love was something you earned by endurance. Daniel watched her bend and felt powerful, mistaking control for compatibility. The marriage turned into a performance where she played support and he played star, and the applause always went one way. But when respect dies silently, what happens to the person who keeps loving? Time passed, and Daniel stopped seeing Amara as a partner at all, viewing her instead as a reminder of a version of himself he wanted to erase. Her presence annoyed him because it reflected patience he no longer valued. He began staying out later, sharing dreams with people who mirrored his ambition, leaving Amara alone with questions he refused to answer. When she expressed hurt, he called it insecurity. When she asked for reassurance, he called it weakness. Slowly, he rewrote the narrative in his own favor. She was holding him back, dragging him down, wasting his potential. That story made leaving easier. It made cruelty feel justified. But stories told to escape guilt often return at the worst possible time, don't they? The final days of the marriage didn't end with a fight. They ended with distance, so wide it felt intentional. Daniel packed his bags with efficiency, already imagining life without explanation or compromise. Amara watched quietly, absorbing the truth that love had been replaced by convenience. He didn't promise to check on her. He didn't ask how she would cope. He simply assumed she would wait, break, or disappear. In his mind, she was already fading. The door closed behind him without ceremony, and Daniel felt relief instead of loss. He thought he had escaped something heavy. He didn't know he had just planted the seed of his own reckoning. Standing on the Lagos street now, watching Amara soaked in mud water, Daniel clung to that old version of events. He told himself she was still that woman, quiet, abandoned, easy to shame. He needed that belief to survive this moment. The crowd fed it too, whispering about how love failed and people fell behind. But Amara's stillness told a different story, one that refused to align with his memories. Contempt had once made her invisible to him. Now, visibility felt dangerous. And for the first time, Daniel wondered if the woman he broke had been rebuilding in silence. Amara felt the weight of those years settle in her chest as the mud dried against her skin, each crack a reminder of nights she cried alone without answers. She remembered how love turned into something conditional, how she learned to survive without applause, without validation, without him. Those years didn't weaken her, they taught her restraint. Standing there now, she wasn't reliving pain. She was standing on top of it. The crowd saw humiliation. Daniel saw control. But beneath the mess, something solid had formed. And when strength is mistaken for submission, the fallout is always worse than expected. As Daniel shifted impatiently, preparing another insult to reclaim dominance, Amara tightened her grip on the envelope, grounding herself in the reality he never bothered to see. The past he relied on was incomplete. The contempt he used as fuel had backfired. And as the silence stretched longer than comfort allowed, one truth hovered dangerously close to the surface. This reunion wasn't reopening an old wound, it was about to expose a new one. Movement rippled through the street the way heat moves through metal, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore, as neighbors adjusted their positions to get a better view, without fully committing to involvement. A woman leaned against a gate pretending to scroll her phone while recording with her camera angled just enough. A roadside mechanic wiped grease from his hands and paused mid-task, curiosity winning over responsibility. Even the breeze seemed to slow, carrying whispers that stitched themselves into a single, dangerous narrative. Nobody spoke out loud, but the silence was loud enough to bruise. This wasn't just Daniel humiliating Amara anymore. It was the community deciding, in real time, what kind of cruelty it would tolerate. And as eyes followed the mud dripping from her clothes, the unspoken question floated between them. Is this entertainment or a warning? Gossip spread in fragments, bouncing from ear to ear like sparks looking for fuel. Someone muttered that she deserved it. Someone else claimed she must have done something terrible to provoke him. A third voice whispered about how women who leave marriages often come back begging. Each comment landed without proof, without empathy, without consequence. Daniel thrived in that atmosphere because community judgment did his work for him. He didn't need to explain himself. The crowd filled in the gaps with their own biases. Amara felt those whispers brush against her skin sharper than the mud, but she stayed still, letting them pass through her without response. Silence, in that moment, wasn't weakness, it was refusal. But how long can silence protect you before it turns into another form of harm? Children hovered at the edges of the scene, sensing drama without understanding its weight, absorbing lessons they would carry into adulthood. They watched how adults laughed. They watched who looked away. They watched how humiliation became normal when the victim didn't fight back. Somewhere behind a wall, a radio played softly, oblivious, while the street rewrote its own moral code. Daniel noticed the attention and leaned into it, adjusting his stance, performing dominance like it was currency. The crowd rewarded him with focus. Amara noticed something else, the way a few faces looked uncomfortable, conflicted, trapped between conscience and fear of standing alone. She saw it clearly now. Cruelty survives best when people wait for someone else to speak first. And what happens when no one ever does? A vendor shifted her tray nervously, eyes darting between Daniel and Amara, calculating risk the way people do when survival depends on staying unnoticed. The security man cleared his throat, stepped forward half a pace, then stopped, bound by the invisible rules of employment and hierarchy. No one wanted trouble. No one wanted to pick sides. In that hesitation, humiliation found shelter. Daniel mistook that shelter for approval, mistook silence for agreement, and his confidence swelled again. He threw another glance at the crowd like a king acknowledging subjects, unaware that public favor is the most unstable ground a man can stand on. But Amara understood something different. The same crowd that empowers cruelty today will testify against it tomorrow, if the story changes fast enough. Phones came out more boldly now, no longer hidden, no longer ashamed. The moment had crossed from private shame into public content. Someone whispered that this would be online within minutes. Another speculated about hashtags, about virality, about how Lagos never forgets a spectacle. Daniel felt invincible in that attention, believing visibility meant control. Amara felt the weight of permanence settle in, knowing that every second mattered now, every movement would be replayed, dissected, judged. She adjusted her posture, lifted her chin slightly, and let the cameras capture her exactly as she was, calm, composed, unbroken. If this moment was going to live forever, she would decide how it was remembered. But would the crowd recognize strength when it didn't shout? The atmosphere thickened as murmurs turned into full conversations, and opinions hardened without facts. Some people began defending Daniel openly, framing his cruelty as discipline, or teaching a lesson. Others stayed quiet but leaned closer, unwilling to miss what felt like a turning point. Amara felt the loneliness of standing alone in a crowd, the kind of loneliness that teaches you exactly who you can rely on. Daniel fed off that isolation, stepping closer again, his shadow stretching toward her like a threat. The community had become a silent accomplice, and everyone sensed that whatever happened next would either justify their silence or expose it. As the sun shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the road, a strange tension settled over the crowd, like the pause before a storm breaks. People sensed that this wasn't ending the way they expected. The whispers slowed. The laughter thinned. Attention sharpened. Amara's stillness began to feel intentional, strategic, almost defiant. Daniel felt it too, even if he couldn't name it yet, a shift in energy, a subtle pull away from his control. The community leaned forward one last time, unaware that their silence was about to be challenged by something louder than any voice, the truth. Assumptions settled over Daniel like a comfortable jacket as he watched Amara stand there, because he had always believed her life paused the day he walked out. In his mind, she stayed suspended in that moment, confused, dependent, waiting for rescue that would never come. He never wondered where she went after the divorce papers were signed. Never imagined her mornings, her nights, her quiet decisions. To him, curiosity required care, and care had ended long ago. That certainty made his cruelty feel logical, even deserved. Yet as he stared at her now, drenched and composed, something in that assumption began to itch, like fabric that no longer fit the body wearing it. Why didn't she look like someone whose life had stopped? Time folded inward as Daniel remembered how easily he had replaced questions with conclusions. He assumed she went back to relatives who pitied her. Assumed she struggled to pay rent. Assumed she talked about him with regret and longing. Those assumptions spared him guilt and effort. They allowed him to move on without accountability. But standing here, with the crowd watching and the sealed envelope visible, the gaps in his knowledge felt louder than any insult he could throw. Amara's calm wasn't ignorance, it was preparation. And preparation always implies a journey, so where had she been all this time? Memory flickered to moments he dismissed. The way she stopped arguing near the end, the way she listened more than she spoke, the way she asked careful questions about things he thought didn't concern her. He had mistaken those moments for surrender. He never considered they were observations. He never wondered what she learned while he underestimated her. Daniel's confidence wavered as the possibility surfaced that Amara had been paying attention while he was busy winning arguments. If that were true, then this moment wasn't accidental, it was chosen. And chosen moments are dangerous. Across the street, the car remained motionless, a quiet punctuation mark to Daniel's growing unease. It didn't belong to any story he'd told himself about Amara's future. He tried to ignore it, but his eyes betrayed him, returning to it again and again like a magnet. That car suggested planning. Planning suggested resources. Resources suggested independence. And independence was the one thing Daniel never believed Amara could achieve without him. His chest tightened as the logic stacked up against his assumptions, brick by uncomfortable brick. Amara felt the weight of his ignorance, like a shield rather than a wound. She remembered how often he never asked if she was okay, never asked what she needed, never asked what she wanted for herself. That neglect forced her to learn herself, to answer questions he never cared enough to voice. Standing there now, she realized something quietly powerful. He didn't know her because he never tried to. And people who don't know you always underestimate you. That realization grounded her, steadying her breath as the moment stretched. The crowd sensed a shift before Daniel fully did. The whispers changed tone, curiosity replacing judgment. People began asking each other questions Daniel never asked himself. Where did she come from? Why does she look so calm? Who owns that car? Each unanswered question weakened his position further, because dominance depends on certainty. And certainty was slipping through his fingers. As Daniel opened his mouth to reclaim control with another assumption disguised as an insult, Amara lifted her gaze slightly, her expression unreadable but resolute. The silence between them felt deliberate now, like the pause before a door swings open. He had spent years not asking the right questions. And in moments, the answers were going to arrive whether he was ready or not. Rain once tapped gently against a cracked window in a one-room apartment miles away from this street, the kind of sound that keeps you awake because silence feels heavier. Amara sat on the edge of a narrow bed, counting the seconds between drops, learning what it meant to be alone without being abandoned. Those early days after the divorce were not dramatic. There were no grand speeches, no sudden miracles. Just exhaustion, uncertainty, and mornings that demanded she stand up even when her body begged to stay down. She learned quickly that survival didn't announce itself. It whispered instructions you had to listen carefully to. And each day she obeyed those whispers, even when no one was watching. Cold mornings followed, and Amara stood in long lines with people who didn't know her story and didn't need to. She filled forms. She learned new routes through unfamiliar streets. She accepted small jobs that bruised her pride but fed her independence. At night, she cried quietly into folded clothes so neighbors wouldn't hear, then wiped her face and planned the next day anyway. Grief didn't come as one wave. It arrived in pieces, at bus stops, in crowded rooms, in the silence after laughter. Yet every tear taught her something Daniel never learned. Pain can educate if you let it. And slowly, without witnesses, she began to change. Time moved differently in those years, stretching and compressing as Amara rebuilt her sense of self. She learned new skills, not because she dreamed big, but because she needed options. She listened more than she spoke, watching how systems worked, how people with power moved quietly, how patience could be sharper than aggression. When opportunities appeared, they were small and easily missed, but she took them anyway. One decision led to another, then another, until a path formed where none had existed before. It wasn't luck. It was accumulation. And accumulation doesn't look impressive until it's complete. Loss followed her like a shadow, but it no longer defined her. Amara buried parts of her old life with intention, the need for validation, the habit of explaining herself, the belief that love must hurt to be real. She replaced those pieces with boundaries, discipline, and an understanding of her own worth. Strength didn't arrive as confidence. It arrived as calm. The calm to say no. The calm to wait. The calm to prepare. Standing alone in that apartment years ago, she never imagined this street, this moment, but she imagined something better. And imagination, when paired with effort, becomes strategy. Success, when it finally came, didn't announce itself with applause. It showed up as stability, as choices, as the ability to leave rooms that disrespected her. Amara learned to protect her progress quietly, to keep her plans sealed from people who thrived on underestimating her. She understood that visibility invites interference, and silence invites freedom. That lesson shaped everything she did afterward. By the time her life shifted visibly, the foundation was already unshakable. And Daniel, lost in his assumptions, never noticed the ground moving beneath his feet. Standing on the Lagos street now, mud drying against her skin, Amara felt those years settle into her posture like armor you don't need to show. Every hardship, every lonely night, every small victory had prepared her for this exact moment. She wasn't reliving pain. She was standing on its outcome. The crowd saw humiliation. Daniel saw the past. But Amara felt the present, solid and earned, and it steadied her heartbeat as the story approached its turn. As the silence stretched and Daniel shifted uneasily, Amara tightened her grip on the envelope, feeling the weight of everything she built inside it. Those quiet years were no longer hidden. They were about to speak. And when they did, the narrative Daniel relied on would finally collapse under the truth he never bothered to learn. Metal caught the sun across the road, sharp and deliberate, as a black sedan sat perfectly aligned with the curb like it had been measured twice before stopping. The paint reflected the street without distortion, swallowing dust and chaos the way calm swallows noise. It didn't belong to the neighborhood rhythm of dented doors and hurried parking. It looked patient, intentional, and as Daniel's eyes drifted toward it again, irritation prickled his skin because nothing about that car matched the story he'd been telling himself. Movement stirred inside the vehicle, not obvious, just enough to confirm presence. A window lowered a fraction, no faces revealed, only the sense of someone watching without urgency. The sound of the engine idling hummed low and controlled, steady like a heartbeat that refused to race. The crowd noticed it too, conversations thinning as attention shifted. Cars don't arrive like that by accident. Not in Lagos. Not in moments already heavy with consequence. And suddenly, Daniel's laughter fell out of place, like music playing after a room has gone quiet. Assumptions scrambled inside Daniel's head as he tried to reassign ownership. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a client, maybe coincidence. But each explanation collapsed under the weight of timing. The car hadn't driven past. It hadn't searched for parking. It had been waiting. His posture stiffened as the truth edged closer. Waiting implies expectation, and expectation implies planning. Planning wasn't supposed to be part of Amara's story. Yet there it was, gleaming across the street like a contradiction he couldn't shout down. Amara didn't turn toward the car immediately, and that restraint mattered. She stayed facing Daniel, letting him feel the discomfort of divided attention. Mud streaked her dress, but her presence felt anchored now, as if the street itself leaned subtly in her favor. When she finally glanced toward the vehicle, it was brief and controlled, not a look of reliance, but acknowledgement. Like checking the time before an appointment you know you're ready for. The crowd shifted again, curiosity sharpening into suspicion. Whispers changed shape, questions replacing judgments. Someone murmured about money. Someone else about lawyers. The security man straightened fully now, eyes alert, professionalism flickering back to life. Daniel sensed authority entering the scene without permission, and his chest tightened as dominance slipped from his grip. A soft click echoed as the car door unlocked, quiet but unmistakable. The sound cut through the street cleaner than any shout. Heads turned. Phones lifted higher. Daniel swallowed, realizing too late that humiliation is loud, but power arrives quietly. And as the door handle moved just enough to promise what was coming next, the balance tipped beyond recovery. Plastic crinkled softly as Amara adjusted the envelope in her hand, the sound barely audible yet powerful enough to cut through the street's tension. Mud still slid down her sleeves in uneven lines, staining fabric and skin, but the envelope remained untouched, clean, firm, deliberate. The contrast was impossible to miss. Daniel's eyes locked onto it now, no longer dismissive, no longer amused. Paper like that didn't belong in a moment of public humiliation. It belonged in offices, courtrooms, rooms where voices lowered and decisions lasted. And as Amara held it steady in the open air, the crowd leaned forward, sensing that whatever was inside carried more weight than any insult. Sunlight caught the embossed seal through the plastic, reflecting sharply, almost arrogantly, like it wanted to be seen. Amara didn't rush. She didn't explain. She let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until Daniel felt the unfamiliar pressure of not being in control of the tempo. His earlier laughter replayed in his mind, now sounding reckless, premature. He tried to scoff again, but the sound died halfway out of his throat because confidence collapses when faced with proof. The envelope didn't argue. It didn't threaten. It simply existed. And existence in moments like this is enough. The crowd's energy shifted again, rippling outward as people recognized the language of authority without needing to read a single word. Phones zoomed in. Whispers sharpened. Someone murmured about court notices. Another mentioned ownership. These weren't rumors anymore. They were possibilities with consequences. Daniel felt the ground tilt under his feet as his mind raced to recall anything that might explain why his ex-wife would be holding sealed documents in public. He came up empty, and emptiness, when exposed, feels like fear. Amara's fingers tightened briefly around the envelope, not from nerves, but from intention. She remembered every form she filled, every office she sat in quietly, every signature she earned with patience rather than noise. Those memories steadied her now. She had learned long ago that paper outlives shouting, that records don't forget, and that truth doesn't need permission to surface. Standing there, soaked in mud but holding proof dry and intact, she embodied that lesson without speaking a word. Daniel shifted his weight, suddenly aware of eyes watching him differently. Not amused, not entertained, evaluating, measuring. He tried to reclaim the moment with posture, with presence, but authority doesn't respond to bravado. It responds to documentation. And the realization hit him slowly, painfully. Whatever was inside that envelope had already been decided somewhere else, long before the street, long before the bucket, long before his laughter. As Amara lifted the envelope slightly, just enough for everyone to see the letterhead clearly through the plastic, a hush settled over the crowd like a held breath. This wasn't the climax yet, but it was the point of no return. Because once documents appear, stories change. And whatever Daniel thought this moment was about, it had just become something much bigger. Air thickened suddenly, as if the street itself had decided to stop breathing, and Daniel felt it first in his chest before he noticed it on anyone else's face. The easy grin he'd worn moments earlier froze halfway into something stiff and unfamiliar. His laughter didn't return this time. It hovered somewhere behind his teeth, trapped, useless. Around him, shoulders that had leaned in for entertainment straightened slowly, cautiously, like people realizing they were standing too close to something dangerous. The joy drained from the scene in real time, leaving behind a brittle silence that pressed against Daniel's ears. Eyes that once watched Amara now watched him. Not openly, not boldly, but enough to make him feel exposed. Phones adjusted their angles. Whispers died mid-sentence. Even the friends who had chuckled earlier took half steps back, creating space without admitting why. Daniel noticed the distance before he understood it. Public favor, he was learning, has a short memory. And humiliation, once it shifts direction, doesn't need an invitation. His body responded instinctively, jaw tightening, shoulders squaring, defensive habits kicking in where confidence used to be. Amara remained still, letting the moment work for her without interference. Mud had dried in patches on her dress now, cracking slightly as she breathed, but she didn't move to clean it away. She didn't need to. The crowd no longer saw dirt, they saw contrast. Her calm against his unraveling became the loudest statement on the street. Daniel tried to speak again, to explain, to mock, to dismiss, but every attempt felt delayed, like sound traveling underwater. Authority was slipping, and he could feel it. The car across the street responded first. The door opened fully now, slow and deliberate, revealing polished shoes touching the pavement. A figure stepped out, not rushed, not aggressive, carrying the quiet weight of someone used to being listened to. The crowd reacted immediately, instinctively recognizing the presence of consequence. Conversations stopped completely. The security man stood at attention. Daniel's breath shortened as his mind raced to assess damage, to calculate escape, to reclaim narrative. But narratives don't survive witnesses. Sweat gathered at Daniel's hairline despite the shade, and he wiped his palms against his trousers without realizing it. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had planned humiliation, not exposure. The laughter that fueled him earlier now felt like evidence, replaying in his head with a cruel echo. Amara finally shifted her weight slightly, not forward, not backward, just enough to signal readiness. She had waited for this exact alignment. Proof visible, audience attentive, authority present. The crowd leaned back now instead of forward, creating a subtle circle around the scene like a courtroom without walls. Judgment had entered the space, and it didn't need shouting. Daniel's mouth opened once more, searching for control through words, but nothing convincing came out. His voice cracked, betraying him, and in that moment, as silence swallowed the street whole, it became clear to everyone watching. This wasn't about mud water anymore. It was about consequences that had finally caught up. As the figure from the car approached Amara calmly, Daniel's gaze followed with growing dread, realization sinking deeper with every step. The street had chosen a new center of gravity, and it no longer revolved around him. Whatever happened next would be permanent. And as laughter completely vanished from the air, replaced by something colder and heavier, Daniel understood too late. This was the moment his story turned against him. Reality closed in on Daniel the way heat presses against skin before a storm breaks, slow but unavoidable, as he became painfully aware that every version of himself he relied on was collapsing at once. The confident man, the successful man, the man who believed he could rewrite history by laughing louder. All of them felt thin now, like costumes peeled away by truth. He stood there, surrounded by faces that no longer reflected admiration, only assessment, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt small without anyone having to say it out loud. The street didn't attack him. It simply showed him who he was. Movement from the side caught his attention again, and his eyes tracked the approaching figure with the instinct of someone who knows authority when it enters a space. Shoes polished, steps measured.
No rules. No noise.
The kind of presence that doesn't need permission because it already has legitimacy. Daniel's mind raced backward, replaying his actions frame by frame, searching desperately for a moment he could undo. The bucket, the laughter, the crowd. Each memory landed like a quiet accusation, stacking evidence against him inside his own head. He realized then that humiliation isn't just something you inflict, it's something you inherit when your actions are exposed. Amara felt the shift immediately, not as triumph, but as clarity. She watched Daniel's posture change, the way his shoulders dipped slightly, the way his eyes lost their sharp edge. This was the moment she had prepared for, not with revenge in mind, but with resolve. She didn't feel anger now. She felt distance. Distance from the woman he once controlled, distance from the pain he assumed still defined her. The calm that wrapped around her wasn't emotional numbness, it was completion. And completion changes how you see people who once defined your limits. Daniel tried to straighten himself again, to reclaim dignity through body language, but the effort felt hollow. His reflection stared back at him from every surface, the glossy car door, the phone screens, the eyes of the onlookers, and none of them showed the man he believed himself to be. They showed someone capable of cruelty when unchecked, someone who mistook power for permission. The realization burned quietly, deeper than embarrassment ever could. He wasn't being punished by the crowd. He was being confronted by himself. The figure beside Amara paused, presence firm and undeniable, and the weight of official attention settled fully on the scene. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to explain, to justify, to reframe, But explanations require credibility, and credibility had drained out of him the moment he lifted that bucket. He understood now that this reckoning had been building long before today, long before he ever saw Amara again. This was simply the day it arrived. The crowd watched without cheering, without cruelty, as if recognizing that some lessons don't need celebration. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling the consequences of his choices pressing inward. The man he thought he was no longer existed. And standing there, exposed and stripped of narrative control, Daniel faced a truth more unsettling than any punishment. This moment wasn't about what would happen to him next. It was about who he had already revealed himself to be. Silence stretched longer than comfort allowed, and Daniel felt it tighten around his throat like a hand that refused to loosen. The street no longer belonged to him, and that realization forced something unfamiliar to the surface. Fear. Not fear of consequences yet, but fear of being seen clearly, without excuses or applause to soften the view. His eyes flicked from the official presence beside Amara to the sealed envelope, then back to her face, searching desperately for a crack he could slip through. The confident man who once controlled the room now stood exposed, and instinct told him the only weapon left was regret, hurried and loud. His body moved before his pride could stop it, shoulders lowering, hands opening in a gesture that looked rehearsed but shaky. The apology came out rough, tangled, tripping over itself in its urgency. It wasn't shaped by understanding, it was shaped by panic. Daniel reached for language that might rewind time, talk of misunderstandings, emotions, stress, the past. Words spilled fast, uneven, as if speed could substitute sincerity. But apologies born from fear carry a certain smell, and the crowd sensed it immediately.
Heads tilted.
Brows furrowed. No one leaned in this time. They listened the way people listen to storms from indoors, aware but unmoved. Amara absorbed his words without reacting, her expression steady, unreadable. She had imagined this moment once, long ago, in a quieter life where closure felt like salvation. Back then, an apology might have mattered. It might have healed something raw. But time had done its work, and healing had already happened without his participation. Standing there now, she felt no pull toward forgiveness, no urge to explain her pain. She had outgrown the need for validation from the person who caused it. And growth changes the weight of apologies. They become lighter, almost irrelevant. Daniel noticed her stillness and mistook it for negotiation, pushing further, promising change, humility, reflection. Each word stacked higher, trying to build a bridge back to safety. But bridges built in emergencies rarely last. The official presence remained silent, letting the moment unfold without interference, understanding that truth reveals itself best when allowed space. The crowd watched with a different kind of attention now, not curious, not cruel, but contemplative. This wasn't entertainment. It was instruction. Amara finally shifted her stance, just enough to signal finality. She didn't interrupt him.
She didn't argue.
She didn't correct the story he was trying to rewrite. Her restraint spoke louder than rejection ever could. Some apologies arrive too late, not because they aren't spoken, but because the person they're meant for no longer needs them. That realization landed on Daniel with a dull, sinking weight, heavier than humiliation. The street held its breath as Daniel's words slowed, then stopped, leaving the air strangely empty. Nothing rushed in to fill the space.
No forgiveness.
No relief. Just consequence waiting patiently. And in that quiet, Daniel understood the cruelest truth of all. Regret doesn't guarantee redemption, and some doors close not out of spite, but out of growth. Morning light softened as clouds drifted lazily overhead, and the street that once felt hostile now felt strangely neutral, like it had finished choosing sides. Amara adjusted her posture one last time, not to appear strong, but because strength no longer required effort. Mud still marked her dress, but it no longer defined her presence. What lingered instead was composure, the kind earned through years of silence, work, and self-repair. She had arrived at this moment not to prove anything, but to complete something. And completion has a quiet dignity, that needs no audience. She took a slow step away from Daniel, not in retreat but in release. The movement was subtle, yet it carried finality. The woman he thought he knew would have waited, argued, or explained. This woman didn't. She didn't look back for approval or acknowledgement. Her focus shifted forward, toward the car, toward the future that had already been built beyond his reach. In that single step, the past loosened its grip, and the distance between who she was and who she had become widened permanently. Daniel watched her go, the weight of realization settling in his chest, too late to change anything. The image of her walking away cut deeper than any punishment could have, because it denied him relevance. He wasn't the villain in her story anymore. He wasn't even the lesson. He was a closed chapter she no longer needed to reference. That understanding hollowed him out, leaving behind a silence louder than his earlier laughter. The crowd began to disperse slowly, conversation subdued, energy drained of spectacle. Some people looked thoughtful. Others looked uncomfortable, recognizing pieces of themselves in what they had witnessed. The street returned to its routine, but something invisible had shifted. A moral line had been drawn and crossed, and everyone had felt it. Moments like this don't announce themselves as life-changing, but they linger, resurfacing later in unexpected ways. Amara reached the car and paused briefly, not for drama, but for grounding. She breathed in, steady and controlled, feeling the weight of her journey settle into peace. The door opened, inviting her forward, and she entered without hesitation. The car pulled away smoothly, carrying her out of the frame, leaving behind a silence that felt earned rather than empty. As Daniel stood alone, surrounded by the aftermath of his choices, the final truth settled unmistakably over the street. Growth ignored becomes power misunderstood. And somewhere, someone watching felt it deeply enough to ask themselves a quiet, dangerous question. Who have I underestimated, and who might be underestimating me right now? If you were the one that was humiliated in this video, and God being so kind later saved you from the hands of your enemies, what will be your reaction towards your oppressors? Comment and subscribe on this channel. Let us know your mind.